They had been told the Americans were monsters. What they found instead was a small-town America that looked nothing like the nightmares fed to them by Nazi propaganda. By 1944, the Third Reich was fighting on collapsing fronts. Yet the machinery of belief inside Germany kept grinding. Joseph Goebbels' ministry painted the enemy as decadent, cruel and racially impure, a people who would torture, humiliate and murder any German who fell into their hands. Boys conscripted at 16 were told that capture meant a fate worse than death. The radio, the schools, and street posters left no room for doubt. The enemy was not human. When thousands of German soldiers were rounded up in Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, and later across France, their expectations were simple and dark. They pictured chained men, starvation rations, daily abuse. They expected to be spat on by civilians or dragged through the streets. Fate, however, had other plans. The Allies followed international law. Tens of thousands of German prisoners were shipped across the Atlantic on military transports and liberty ships to POW camps across the United States. Not to secret prisons, but to the heartland, Texas,
Iowa, Arizona, and Georgia.
The journey itself was an education. Men, who had never crossed a national border, watched the Atlantic seascape and imagined they were heading to some terrible unknown. Instead, they were carried into a world that, for many, felt surreal. Arrival at the camps broke the first stone of propaganda. Guards distributed blankets, soap, and hot meals. Cots were lined in barracks. Red Cross parcels waited for those who would receive them. For many prisoners, the first American faces they saw were not soldiers snarling with hate, but local volunteers, nurses and chaplains. Neighbors brought food, children waved from behind fences, and farmers offered work. One former prisoner later described that moment simply, "We expected chains. Instead, we were given coffee and a place to sleep." Official U.S. policy was clear and public. Prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. That commitment translated into surprising comforts, sufficient food measured against U.S. military rations, medical care, opportunities for work, and in many camps, access to education and recreation. POWs quickly realized that complaining had little effect, but it rarely mattered. For the first time, many of them had enough to eat every day. By the time a prisoner settled into camp life, many had already begun to wrestle with a paradox. The nation they had been taught to hate treated them with a humanity their leaders had denied them. The first chapters of this story are not about mass conversions or immediate remorse. They are about a slow, disorienting confrontation between what one was told to believe and what one had to look at with his own eyes. For thousands of German soldiers, that confrontation would mark the beginning of a very different kind of journey, one that moved from captivity to reflection, from propaganda to the painful work of reappraisal. When German soldiers first arrived at American POW camps, the reality was almost unbelievable. Many had expected chains, shouting guards, and starvation. Instead, they encountered orderly barracks, freshly painted wooden floors, and officers quietly supervising recreational activities. Each camp was designed according to Geneva Convention standards, and yet in practice, the treatment often exceeded the expectations of the prisoners themselves. Beds were arranged in rows. Each man received clean blankets and uniforms, and Red Cross packages, filled with chocolate, canned meats, and cigarettes, became a prized part of daily life. Food alone was a revelation. Meals were substantial, balanced, and sometimes even gourmet by the standards of a hungry European soldier. German prisoners who had subsisted on thin soup and black bread were suddenly served hearty stews, fresh milk and fruit. The daily ration system was meticulously managed. Officers kept careful records, and any deficiency was immediately addressed. Beyond sustenance, camp life included work, recreation, and education. Prisoners were often assigned to labor details, particularly on farms and in local industries. Here they planted crops, harvested cotton, repaired roads, and maintained buildings. This work was not forced in a brutal sense. It was structured, supervised, and compensated with extra privileges. Local communities, initially wary, began to interact with the POWs. Farmers observed them diligently working the fields, and soon casual conversations arose. Inside the camps, prisoners discovered avenues for mental and cultural engagement. Music and theater became vital parts of daily life. Prisoners formed orchestras and small theater troupes, performing German classics and operettas. Soccer matches were organized between different barracks or even between POWs and local teams. Some camps had libraries, stocked with books from both Germany and the United States. Men learned English from the newspapers, from instruction offered by American officers, and from casual conversations with civilians and guards. Medical care was another area that astounded many POWs. Those who arrived sick, malnourished, or wounded received treatment equal to or better than that of American soldiers. Infections were treated quickly, and psychological counseling, limited though it was, helped men adjust to the bizarre reality of being treated with dignity by those they had been conditioned to hate. Even within the hierarchy of the camp, an unusual sense of order prevailed. German officers retained some authority among the prisoners. They could manage internal disputes, enforce discipline, and organize work details. Yet every decision had to align with American supervision. This dual system created a strange balance. The prisoners maintained a sense of autonomy, but always under the watchful eye of their captors. One of the most striking features of camp life was the human interaction between POWs and Americans. Soldiers reported being spoken to politely, often addressed by their names, and sometimes even befriended. Civilians brought gifts during holidays, baked goods, newspapers, or handcrafted items. Children waved to the prisoners from outside the fences, breaking the barrier of fear and preconception. Every friendly gesture chipped away at the fear and hatred instilled in them from childhood. By the end of 1944, German POWs in the United States had begun to see an unexpected truth. Humanity could exist even in the midst of war, and their so-called enemies could be kind, disciplined, and fair. This slow transformation was neither immediate nor complete, but it planted the seeds for a profound change in perception, one that would follow many of these men for the rest of their lives. As the months passed, the German prisoners began to confront a reality that clashed violently with everything they had been taught to believe. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as morally corrupt, cruel, and decadent, but the world they encountered in the American heartland was nothing like the nightmares they had imagined. Instead, they saw orderly towns, well-fed citizens, children attending school without fear, and ordinary people going about their lives with calm dignity. The cognitive dissonance was profound. For many, it triggered confusion, suspicion, and eventually, reflection. Inside the camps, intellectual engagement became a natural outlet for the prisoners. Officers and educated men organized discussion groups, debates, and lectures. They debated the nature of democracy, the causes of war, and the ethics of obedience versus conscience. Some POWs recalled later that for the first time in their lives, they were allowed to question authority without fear of reprisal. It was a strange, unsettling freedom, one that contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchy and indoctrination they had experienced in Germany. The U.S. Army recognized this potential for reflection and in some camps began to introduce programs of re-education. These were not propaganda exercises, but opportunities for prisoners to understand democratic principles, civil rights, and the responsibilities of citizenship. POWs watched newsreels depicting life in American towns, factories, and schools. They read newspapers and magazines that showed debate, criticism, and dissent, concepts almost entirely absent from Nazi Germany. Some prisoners resisted these lessons, clinging to the ideology they had been raised with. Others, however, could not ignore the living evidence of a different way of life. One German officer later recalled in an archival memoir, "I was taught that Americans were weak, decadent, and immoral. Yet I saw young men working in the fields, women directing schools, and people speaking freely without fear. It was impossible to reconcile with what I had been told. For the first time I felt doubt, real doubt. The physical conditions of the camps also amplified this reflection. Prisoners had time, hours, days, weeks, to sit quietly, write letters, read, or walk through the grounds. The monotony of captivity allowed thoughts that were previously suppressed to surface. Many wrote letters home describing what they saw: fields full of crops, towns without rubble, markets brimming with goods, and most shocking of all, Americans treating them as human beings rather than enemies. These experiences created a psychological shock that lingered. Some prisoners developed deep admiration for the society around them, while others became increasingly disillusioned with the propaganda that had once defined their worldview. Soldiers who had participated in atrocities in Europe found themselves forced to reconsider their actions, to reflect on personal responsibility, and to question the moral framework they had inherited. By the spring of 1945, German POWs in America had begun to internalize lessons that no battlefield could have taught. They had witnessed a society organized not around fear, coercion, or hate, but around fairness, law, and mutual respect. While not all prisoners converted or renounced their ideology, thousands returned home with a new perspective, one that would influence post-war Germany in subtle yet enduring ways. By 1945, there were more than 425,000 German prisoners of war held across the United States, scattered in hundreds of camps, stretching from the sun-scorched deserts of Arizona to the rolling farmlands of Iowa and the forests of Georgia. These men had come to the United States expecting brutality, cruelty, and constant fear. Instead, they encountered a world that both confounded and humanized them. Life behind the barbed wire was structured, orderly, and often surprisingly humane. And for many, it became a place where the first cracks in years of propaganda could grow into lasting reflection. Daily routines in the camps included work, recreation, and limited education. Many prisoners labored on local farms, harvesting crops, tending animals, or repairing equipment. Initially, these interactions were tense. American farmers were cautious, and the Germans wary. But over time, human connections began to form. Farmers noticed diligence, politeness, and even humor among the prisoners. In some cases, POWs were trusted with responsibilities that required initiative, judgment, and reliability. One Iowa farmer recalled, "They were careful, honest, and hard-working. After a few weeks, it felt like we were not supervising enemies but partners." Inside the camps, recreation played a surprisingly central role in shaping perceptions. Soccer matches became competitive events, watched by both prisoners and American guards. Music filled the barracks as prisoners formed orchestras and performed pieces from home. Theatrical performances, often adaptations of German plays, allowed men to express creativity and maintain a sense of identity. In libraries, prisoners studied English, read newspapers, and explored literature that contrasted starkly with the controlled information they had been fed in Germany. These activities were more than leisure. They were windows into a world of normalcy and freedom. Religious services also provided structure and moral reflection. Chaplains of various denominations offered guidance and support, sometimes bridging divides between soldiers who had been indoctrinated with extreme ideologies. In some camps, Jewish American chaplains even spoke to German POWs about the consequences of Nazi policies, creating moments of intense cognitive dissonance and moral reckoning. Prisoners were confronted not only with acts of humanity but with truths about the crimes of the regime they had served. Even small gestures had a powerful impact. Townspeople sent packages of food, clothing, and gifts for holidays, often with handwritten notes. Children waved from outside the fences, called greetings, or left drawings for the prisoners. These simple acts of kindness, repeated daily, challenged the core of what prisoners had been taught about Americans. One former POW later wrote in his memoir, "I had been told the Americans were monsters, yet here were children smiling at me, and people treating me as a person, not an enemy. I could not comprehend it." By the time the war drew to a close, many German POWs had experienced months, even years of this unusual captivity. Their reflections ranged from astonishment to gratitude, and for some a re-evaluation of their own actions and beliefs. Human bonds formed behind barbed wire, small acts of trust and decency, would leave lasting impressions, shaping the way these men viewed the world for decades to come. In a war defined by hatred and destruction, the POW camps in America stood out as islands of unexpected humanity, places where prisoners learned that compassion could survive, even in the midst of conflict. With the end of World War II in 1945, the massive network of German POW camps across the United States faced a monumental task, returning hundreds of thousands of men to a devastated Europe. By late 1945 and into 1946, ships carried these men back across the Atlantic, into a homeland shattered by years of war, bombings, and economic collapse. Yet the soldiers who stepped off the ships were not the same as the men who had arrived in America years earlier. They had been transformed, subtly, but irrevocably, by months or years of captivity in a country they had been taught to hate. For many prisoners, the journey home was a time of reflection. They carried memories of orderly camps, generous treatment, and daily interactions that had contradicted everything they had been told. Soldiers remembered farm work where
American civilians had trusted them with responsibility.
children waving through fences, chaplains offering guidance without judgment, and neighbors sharing food and conversation. These experiences were so alien to the propaganda of the Reich that many could hardly believe them. Yet they could not unsee the truth. One former POW later wrote in his memoir, "I returned to Germany a soldier no longer, but a witness. I had seen how people could live with decency, freedom, and respect for one another. America had defeated us with its weapons, yes, but it had won our hearts with humanity." In post-war Germany, the impact of these experiences manifested in subtle but powerful ways. Many former POWs became teachers, engineers, and journalists who helped rebuild a democratic society. Some used their stories to challenge lingering Nazi ideologies among friends and family, describing a country that treated enemies not as monsters but as young men who had worked, learned, and changed under their care. Psychologically, the transformation was profound. German soldiers who had once fully believed in Nazi ideology now had personal experience of a society grounded in freedom, fairness, and law. The experience forced many to wrestle with personal guilt and moral responsibility, leading to reflections on obedience, authority, and human rights. The story of German POWs in the United States is a remarkable footnote in the history of World War II. While the war itself was defined by destruction, fear, and brutality, these camps demonstrated that humanity could survive even in captivity. Through structured routines, fair treatment, recreation, education, and simple acts of kindness, the POWs were exposed to a world very different from the one they had been taught to believe existed. The result was not only survival, but a deep, lasting impression that reshaped perceptions, challenged propaganda, and left a legacy that endured long after the guns fell silent. In the end, the German prisoners returned to a Europe in ruins, but they carried something rare, a vision of a world where decency, fairness, and human kindness could prevail. America had shown them a paradox, that an enemy could be a teacher, captivity could be a classroom, and compassion could achieve what force never could. And in this, the war had created an unexpected victory. Not measured in territory or arms, but in the human hearts it quietly transformed